Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. The morning started like any other, the coffee pot bubbling in sync with the soft hum of early morning radio, the soft padding of my footsteps as I sorted through the day's plans. Nothing about the day hinted at what was about to unfold. Diane entered the kitchen, freshly showered, her face a mask of calm confidence. She moved with purpose, her gaze barely grazing mine as she poured herself a mug of coffee, a small twist of something unreadable in her expression. I sensed something coming, but I couldn't place it. Not yet. "I'll be out tonight," she said, her voice measured, controlled. She took a sip of her coffee and set it down, meeting my eyes with a look that was both cool and distant. "Probably won't be back until morning." Her words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. I felt something shift in the room, like the quiet before a storm. I blinked, letting the words settle, trying to unravel what she was really saying. Her tone had been casual, but I caught a note of something rehearsed, a deliberate detachment. This wasn't a request for a night out with friends or a casual evening away. This was a statement, something final, something beyond a simple break from the routine. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady, even as the unease prickled through me. I felt the twist of anger and confusion knotting in my chest, but I kept it buried, waiting for her to explain herself. Diane let out a soft sigh, as if I were already exhausting her. I need some time, James. Time to explore, to find out who I am outside of this." She gestured vaguely, as though this were some binding, limiting thing that held her back. Our life, our marriage, was just this now. I stood there, trying to process what she was saying. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a slow understanding dawning that this wasn't a conversation about us, it was about her. About what she had already decided, probably long before she had worked up the nerve to say it out loud. There was a finality in her tone, a certainty that she expected me to accept. She continued, and her words sounded rehearsed, polished in a way that told me she had been preparing for this. "It's not that I don't love you, James. I do. I just need something more, something different. I need to know what else is out there. I don't want to look back on my life and wonder what could have been. You understand that, right?" Understand? Did she expect me to nod along as she laid out her plans to leave? My hands tightened around the edge of the counter, and I felt the familiar surge of anger I had worked so hard to keep in check. I wasn't the type to explode, to yell or throw things, but right now, that anger was the only thing keeping me from collapsing under the weight of her words. She watched me, waiting, as though she was gauging my reaction. I could see it in her eyes, the confidence, the way she had convinced herself that she deserved this, that I would simply stand aside and let her have it. I wanted to yell, to ask her how she could throw everything away so casually, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I forced myself to take a breath, to keep my voice even. "And what am I supposed to do with that, Diane? Just stand here and nod while you explore?" She looked away, as if she couldn't bear to see the impact of her words. "I thought you'd understand. You're always so strong, so stable. I knew you'd be able to handle this." There it was. She thought I was strong enough to let her leave, to stand by while she tore apart everything we had built together. She wanted me to be the one who stayed while she went out, came back whenever she wanted, treating our life like a pit stop between whatever it was she thought she was missing out on. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth, a sharp reminder of all the sacrifices I had made, the ways I had supported her through every change and shift. "Diane," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "you can't just drop this on me and expect me to accept it. This isn't something I signed up for." She looked at me with a hint of frustration, a flicker of impatience in her gaze. "It's just a few months. I need this, James. And if you love me, you'll understand. I'll still be your wife. This doesn't change what we have." I wanted to laugh, to shout, to tell her how absurd she sounded. But the words that came out were not what I expected. I'd rather not. She blinked, momentarily caught off guard, and I saw her confidence waver. It was a small, fleeting crack, but it was there. What do you mean? I repeated it, louder this time. I'd rather not. I let the words settle between us, letting her feel the weight of them. She had expected me to break, to bend to her plan, but I wasn't going to play the part she had written for me. Diane's face twisted with irritation. She hadn't anticipated this. She had been so sure that I would go along, so certain that I would accept her terms without a fight. But as I looked at her, I felt a calm wash over me, a sense of control that I hadn't felt in years. I could see her trying to adjust, scrambling to regain the upper hand. She took a step forward, softening her tone. James, I don't want to hurt you. This is just something I need. You're strong, you can handle this. It's only temporary. I didn't flinch, didn't soften. I kept my gaze steady. Temporary or not, you've made your choice. And I'm making mine. My words were measured, calm, and I watched as her frustration grew. She had expected an argument, maybe even a confrontation, but instead, I was giving her nothing to latch onto. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Diane shifted uncomfortably, as though the ground had suddenly become unstable. She tried again, reaching out to touch my arm, but I pulled back. I could see her confusion, the way she was scrambling to regain control. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think you'd react like this. I forced a tight smile, feeling the sting of her betrayal but refusing to let it show. I guess you didn't know me as well as you thought. Her face fell, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of regret in her eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by that familiar look of determination. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as though preparing for battle. You're going to have to accept this, James. I need this, and I'm going to do it with or without your support. I felt the anger flare again, but I held it in check, letting my words come out calm and steady. Do what you need to do, Diane. But don't expect me to wait around for you to come back. Her jaw tightened, a flash of irritation crossing her face. She had wanted me to be the one who stayed, the one who waited for her to finish her exploring. But as I looked at her, I knew I was done. Done with the excuses, the rehearsed lines, the empty promises. And I could see it in her eyes, the dawning realization that I wasn't going to be the man who waited. She had chosen her path, and now it was time for me to choose mine. In the days that followed Diane's announcement, a strange calm settled over me. I went through the motions, work, dinners, moments with our kids, but everything felt muted, as though I were watching my own life through a pane of glass. Diane's words still echoed in my mind, each line of her well-rehearsed speech playing on a loop. She was exploring, she was finding herself, and I was simply meant to wait, a reliable constant in her life, no matter what she did. But I didn't feel reliable. I felt betrayed. Diane was mostly absent, flitting through the house like a shadow, coming home late and leaving early, her excuses thin and her expressions guarded. I caught snippets of her conversations on the phone, whispered words punctuated by forced laughter. I didn't need to hear every word to understand. She was slipping further away, and I was beginning to see just how far gone she already was. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the door creaked open, and Diane entered. She looked surprised to see me sitting there, perhaps expecting that I'd gone to bed without waiting up. She shifted, hesitant, and for a moment, a flash of guilt flickered in her eyes. But just as quickly, it disappeared. I didn't expect you to be up, she said, her voice soft, as though she were testing the waters. Neither did I replied, my tone flat. I gestured to the chair across from me. Sit down, Diane. We need to talk. She hesitated but eventually took a seat, folding her hands in her lap, looking at me with an expression that was both wary and defensive. It was a look that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. "What is it, James?" she asked, feigning patience. I took a breath, steadying myself, the questions I'd been holding back finally pressing forward. "Do you think this is fair? To me, to the kids?" I met her gaze, searching for a shred of remorse, some indication that she understood the impact of her actions. But she simply looked away, her expression hardening. "It's not about fair, James," she replied. "It's about what I need. I told you that from the beginning." "You told me what you decided," I said, keeping my voice even, though I felt the anger simmering beneath the surface. "But you didn't ask me. You didn't think, even for a second, about how I might feel, or what this might do to our family." Diane's lips tightened, and she crossed her arms, as if bracing herself against my words. "I'm tired of sacrificing myself for everyone else. I've spent years putting this family first, putting you first. And now it's my turn." I stared at her, disbelief mingling with the anger. "Sacrifice? Diane, we built this life together. We made choices together. And now, because you're bored, because you think you're missing out, you want to throw it all away?" "It's not that simple," she shot back, her voice rising. "You wouldn't understand. You never had to question anything. You've always had your life mapped out, while I'm the one who feels trapped." "Trapped?" I repeated, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Then why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell me you felt this way?" Diane shook her head, a flash of frustration crossing her face. "Because it wouldn't have mattered. You're so focused on everything being perfect, on keeping everything just right, that you would have dismissed it. You never want to look at the cracks, James." I felt a pang at her words, but I couldn't let them sink in, couldn't let myself believe that this was somehow my fault. I had tried, hadn't I? I had done everything I could to support her, to give her a life she would be proud of. I had thought we were a team. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor, and a heavy silence settled between us. I wanted to reach across, to touch her hand, to somehow break through this wall that had sprung up between us. But I knew, deep down, that it was already too late. After a long pause, Diane let out a sigh, a faint, resigned sound that cut through the silence. "I can't keep living like this, James. I need to figure out who I am outside of this marriage. I need to see if there's something more." I felt a cold, hollow feeling settle in my chest, the finality of her words hitting me with a brutal force. She wasn't just leaving for a night or even a few weeks. She was leaving because she believed there was something better out there, something she couldn't find with me. For a moment, I didn't trust myself to speak. I could feel the anger building, threatening to spill over, but I forced it down, kept it buried beneath the calm facade I had maintained for so long. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. "Then go," I said, my voice steady, though every word felt like a blow. "If you need to find yourself so badly, then go. But don't expect me to be here when you decide to come back." Diane's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise breaking through her mask of calm. She hadn't expected that. She had thought I would wait, that I would bend to her wishes, just as I had so many times before. But this time, I wasn't going to be the one left standing. "James," she started, her voice softer now, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. "I'm done, Diane. You want to throw away everything we've built? Fine. But I won't stand by and let you drag me down with you." She stared at me, shock and something else, perhaps regret, flickering in her eyes. But she quickly masked it, her expression hardening once more. She rose from her seat, her movements stiff, controlled. "If that's how you feel," she said, her voice cold, "then maybe it's best if I go." I nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle over me, a final, undeniable truth. There was no going back from this. We had crossed a line, and there was no way to erase it. Diane left the room without another word, her footsteps echoing down the hall. A moment later, I heard the door to our bedroom close, and I was left alone in the silence, the reality of what had just happened sinking in with brutal clarity. The next morning, Diane was gone. There was no note, no explanation, just an empty closet and a silence that felt like a physical weight pressing down on the house. I went through the motions of the day, numb and detached, barely able to process what had happened. I told the kids that their mother had gone away for a little while, that she needed some time, and they accepted it with the unthinking trust of children, unaware of the fracture that had split their family apart. But as the days passed, that numbness faded, replaced by a slow, simmering anger. Every empty space, every silent room, was a reminder of what Diane had done, of the life she had walked away from without a second thought. And as that anger grew, it sharpened into a resolve, a determination that I hadn't felt in years. She thought she could leave, that she could walk away and expect me to wait, to be here when she decided she was done exploring. But I was done waiting. I was done playing the role she had written for me. Over the next few weeks, I began to make changes. Small ones at first, things that only I would notice, a shift in the furniture, a new paint color in the living room. But as time went on, those changes grew bolder. I packed away Diane's things, cleared out the remnants of her presence that lingered like ghosts in the empty rooms. I was reclaiming my life, bit by bit, taking back the space she had left behind. And with every change, every decision, I felt a sense of freedom, a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't realized was there. Diane had walked away, had left me to pick up the pieces of our life. But as I looked around at the home I was building anew, I realized that I was finally finding something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace. A few weeks passed, and Diane's absence settled over the house, a cold reminder of the fracture she had left in her wake. For the first time, I found myself without her familiar, sometimes critical presence, without the constant feeling that I had to live up to her expectations. At first, I thought I would feel adrift, lost without the routine we had built together. But instead, I felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The anger I had felt in the days after her departure had dulled, leaving behind a strange clarity, a steady resolve. I spent more time with the kids, making dinners and planning weekend outings to places we had once only half-heartedly visited as a family. I realized how many small moments I had missed, how many details had gone unnoticed because I had been so caught up in keeping the peace, in holding our family together. Now, there was no more pretending. No more hollow attempts at normalcy. Diane's absence had given us a chance to rebuild, to start over without the looming shadow of her discontent. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I found myself sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in my hand as I looked around at the changes I had made. The furniture was arranged differently, small touches I'd added to make the space feel like mine. Diane's belongings had been cleared away, the lingering traces of her presence replaced by things that felt like they belonged to me and the kids. It was as though I were creating a new life from the ashes of the old, shaping a future that was no longer bound to her choices. But just as I was beginning to feel that I had regained control, that I was moving forward, the phone rang. I hesitated, the sound breaking the quiet like a sharp crack. I glanced at the clock. It was late, nearly midnight. Only a handful of people ever called me this late, and most of them were either family or close friends. But the number on the screen wasn't familiar. Something in me tightened, a sense of foreboding creeping up my spine as I answered. Hello. My voice came out gruffer than I intended, but I didn't care. Whoever was on the other end had interrupted my peace, and I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. James. The voice was faint, shaky. But I recognized it immediately. Diane. My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to hear from her so soon, if at all. I held the phone to my ear, waiting, the silence between us stretching out like a chasm. James, I know it's late, she stammered, her voice trembling. I wouldn't have called if it wasn't. I just didn't know who else to call. My grip tightened on the phone, a surge of emotions flooding through me, anger, resentment, a pang of something that felt almost like pity. But I kept my tone neutral, unwilling to give her an inch. What do you want, Diane? There was a pause, a hitch in her breath that I recognized as hesitation. She was holding something back, perhaps the same way she had when she first told me she needed to explore. But this time, there was no confidence in her voice, no trace of the defiant certainty she had shown that day in the kitchen. She sounded broken. I just needed to talk to someone. I didn't know who else to call, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. They didn't work out the way I thought they would. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Oh, really? And here I thought your exploration would be everything you'd hoped for. She flinched at the sarcasm in my tone, but I couldn't bring myself to care. She had left without a second thought, had walked out on our life, our family, all for some vague notion of self-discovery. And now she wanted sympathy. James, please, she murmured, her voice breaking. I know I don't have any right to ask, but I'm struggling. I didn't know who else to turn to. I leaned back, the anger ebbing slightly as I processed her words. She sounded lost, a faint echo of the woman I had once known. It was as though her bravado had crumbled, leaving behind a hollow shell. Part of me wanted to hang up, to end the call and let her deal with the consequences of her choices. But another part, a part one didn't want to admit was still there, felt a pang of guilt. What happened, Diane? I asked, my voice softening slightly, though I kept my tone guarded. There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought she might have hung up. But then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. He left me, she admitted, and I could hear the raw pain in her voice, the bitterness that laced every word. It turns out that what I thought it wasn't real. He never cared about me. Not really. I closed my eyes, a wave of emotions washing over me. I should have felt satisfaction, a sense of vindication. She had left me, left our family, only to be abandoned herself. But all I felt was a hollow ache, a reminder of everything we had lost. And what do you want me to do about it, Diane? I asked, keeping my voice steady. You made your choice. You wanted to find yourself, remember? She let out a shuddering breath, and I could almost picture her, sitting somewhere alone, her confidence shattered, her world crumbling. I know, and I don't deserve anything from you. I thought you might understand. Understand? I repeated, a bitter edge creeping into my tone. You walked out on everything we built, Diane. You left me, you left the kids, all because you wanted something more. And now you expect me to understand? I don't expect anything, she said softly, her voice filled with resignation. I wanted to tell you. I know I hurt you. And I'm sorry. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. I could feel the old anger rising again, the bitterness of her betrayal still fresh, still raw. But as I listened to her, I realized that there was nothing more to say. Her apology, hollow as it was, didn't change what she had done. It didn't erase the months of silence, the nights I had spent alone, wondering what I could have done differently. After a while, I let out a sigh, the last traces of anger slipping away, replaced by a cold, steady resolve. Diane, I appreciate the apology. But it doesn't change anything. You made your choice, and I made mine. I'm moving on, and you should too. There was a soft, broken sound on the other end of the line, a small, choked sob that twisted something in me, though I forced myself to ignore it. I wasn't going to be pulled back into her orbit, wasn't going to let her drag me down with her regrets. I understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I guess I just needed to hear you say it. I took a breath, steadying myself, the finality of her words settling over me like a cold weight. This was it, the end of everything we had once been, the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. Goodbye, Diane, I said, my voice calm, even as I felt the sharp sting of those words. I ended the call, letting the silence fill the room once more, the faint echo of her voice fading into nothingness. For a moment, I sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, the weight of the conversation settling over me like a heavy blanket. I felt the familiar ache, the hollow sense of loss, but this time, there was something else, a sense of closure, a quiet finality that I hadn't felt before. Diane had made her choice, and she had paid the price. And now, so had I. I placed the phone on the table, leaning back as a wave of calm washed over me. This was the end, the final chapter in a story that had long since lost its meaning. And as I sat there, alone in the quiet, I felt a sense of peace, a strange, bittersweet relief. There was no going back now. The life I had once shared with Diane was over, and all that was left was the future, a new beginning that lay ahead, waiting for me to claim it. In the weeks that followed my final conversation with Diane, I threw myself into my new life. I immersed myself in work, poured my energy into the kids, and kept pushing forward, determined to put the past behind me. Diane's absence, once a glaring hole in our lives, became less jarring, fading into the background as I rebuilt my own version of home. I thought I had found peace, a calm acceptance of everything I had lost and everything I still had. Then, one early evening, as I was driving back from picking up the kids, I saw the light flash on my phone. The call was from a number I didn't recognize, but something about it felt urgent, pressing. I quickly found a place to pull over, my heart pounding with an inexplicable sense of dread as I answered. "Is this James?" a woman's voice asked, soft but formal. There was a slight tremor in her voice that set off alarm bells in my mind. "Yes, this is he," I replied, my voice tightening with apprehension. "This is Officer Campbell. I'm calling from Charlotte Police Department," she began. My heart sank, the words blurring as panic set in. "We've been trying to reach the next of kin for Diane Matthews. I'm afraid there's been an accident." The world around me seemed to go silent, every sound muffled, fading into a low hum as her words registered. An accident. I felt the air escape my lungs, the weight of her words sinking into my bones. She was found early this morning," the officer continued, her tone softening as she sensed my shock. "She was driving home, and it seems her car veered off the road. It was quick, James." I could barely breathe, my mind struggling to process the weight of her words. I had convinced myself that Diane was no longer part of my life, that she was a chapter one had closed. But now, faced with the finality of her death, I felt an ache, a hollow, twisting pain that clawed at my chest. Was she alone? I managed to ask, the words barely audible. The officer hesitated before responding. "Yes." It seemed she had been driving alone for quite some time. There were no signs of any other vehicles involved. It appears to have been a single-car accident. I sat there in stunned silence, the phone pressed to my ear, every word feeling like a physical blow. A part of me wanted to ask why she had been driving alone, where she had been going. But another part, the part that had clung to my anger, felt that the questions no longer mattered. She was gone, and there was nothing I could do to change that. "Thank you for letting me know," I whispered, my voice hollow, my thoughts a chaotic mess of guilt and regret. After a long silence, Officer Campbell's voice softened. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm very sorry for your loss, James." I ended the call, still reeling, staring out into the darkening sky. The kids were in the back seat, oblivious, laughing over some game they were playing, their innocent voices the only sound cutting through the silence. I wanted to hold on to that sound, that sliver of normalcy, as the weight of Diane's death bore down on me. I could barely focus on the drive home, my mind lost in memories, images of Diane flickering through my mind, moments I had forgotten, moments I thought I had erased. The way she laughed, the gentle rise and fall of her voice, the way she had once looked at me with warmth before everything between us had turned cold. Once home, I put the kids to bed, each of them falling asleep without realizing the storm brewing in my heart. I stayed by their doors for a while, watching them sleep, feeling the responsibility I now bore as the only parent left, the only one who could offer them comfort, stability. It was a weight I had carried before, but now it felt different, more permanent, more terrifying. Later, in the quiet of the night, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, Diane's death pressing in on me. I reached for a box I had kept tucked away, a box I hadn't opened since she'd left. It was filled with fragments of our life together, photographs, mementos, reminders of the love we had once shared. There was one picture that caught my eye, one I had almost forgotten existed. It was a photograph of us on our wedding day, standing outside in the rain, our faces lit up with laughter as we tried to shield ourselves with a tiny umbrella. I could see the happiness in our eyes, the unshakable belief that we would be together forever. I hadn't realized how far we had drifted, how much we had lost, until it was too late. The ache in my chest grew, and before I knew it, I was gripping the photo, my hands shaking as the tears began to fall. I had spent so much time being angry, so much time nursing my bitterness, that I had forgotten the reasons we had loved each other, the reasons I had once looked at her with hope. I had no idea why Diane had been alone that night, what had led her to that stretch of road. But in that moment, none of it mattered. I realized that, despite everything, despite the hurt and the betrayal, I had loved her. And now, she was gone, taking with her all the unresolved pain, the unspoken apologies that would never be heard. In the days that followed, I made arrangements, taking care of the final details, a numbness settling over me as I went through the motions. Diane's death was a quiet affair, a small service with just a handful of people, most of them strangers. She had left the world the way she had left me, quietly, without ceremony, without explanation. I didn't take the kids to the service, I couldn't bring myself to make them face a loss they couldn't understand. Instead, I told them that their mother had loved them, that she had wanted them to be happy. It was the only truth I could give them, the only truth I could bring myself to believe. As the final remnants of Diane's life were packed away, I stood in the empty room, the silence pressing in on me, the weight of everything we had lost settling over me like a shroud. I had thought her absence was something I could survive, something I could overcome. But now, as I looked at the empty space where her belongings had once been, I realized that I would carry her with me forever, a ghost, a memory, a wound that would never heal. And as I walked away, leaving the life we had once shared behind, I understood that the end of her life was also the end of mine, in a way I had never anticipated. Diane was gone, but she had left an indelible mark on my heart, a scar that would never fade. And though I tried to hold on to the future, to look ahead, I knew that a part of me would always linger in that past, bound to the love I had lost, haunted by the life I had once believed would last forever.